The auctioneer's laughter echoed across the empty parking lot where maybe 15 people had gathered on a Tuesday morning to bid on properties nobody wanted, and Jacob Reese couldn't tell if the sound was mockery or genuine amusement at the fact that someone had actually offered money for the collapsing tobacco warehouse on Route 12. $415 for a structure so deteriorated that county inspectors had condemned it 3 years ago, so worthless that the minimum bid had been lowered twice and still attracted no interest until Jacob raised his hand with the desperate calculation of a man who had no good options left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer, a round man named Carl Hodges who'd been selling foreclosed properties in Stratford County for 30 years, wiped tears from his eyes as he brought down the gavel. Sold to bidder 23 for $415. Son, I hope you know what you're doing, because that building's about 2 strong winds from falling down completely. Jacob didn't know what he was doing, not really. He just knew that his 12-year-old daughter Mia needed a place to live that wasn't his sister's crowded apartment where they'd been staying since the eviction, and that the tobacco warehouse sat on 2 acres of land that might, if he could salvage anything from the structure before it collapsed, provide enough material to build something small but livable. A tiny house, a shed converted to living space, anything that would give them privacy and independence and the dignity of having their own door to lock at night. He signed the paperwork in Carl's office, transferring his last dollars to county coffers in exchange for a deed to property that was more liability than asset. Carl looked at him with a mixture of pity and curiosity as he handed over the keys, old brass things that looked like they'd been cut before World War II. The Thornton warehouse has been sitting empty since 1989, Carl said, his earlier amusement replaced by something more serious. Family that owned it went bankrupt during the tobacco settlement, lost everything. Building's been through 3 owners since then, all of them trying to develop the property and giving up when they realized how much it would cost to demolish that structure properly. He paused. You planning to live there? Planning to salvage what I can and build something small on the land. The structure itself is too far gone to save. Probably right about that. But be careful in there, floors are rotted, roof's got holes, structural integrity is questionable at best. Don't go in alone, don't go in at night, and for God's sake don't let that daughter of yours anywhere near it until you've assessed what's safe. Jacob drove to the warehouse that afternoon, Mia beside him in the truck that had 200,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on for 3 months. The building appeared in the distance first, a massive brick structure that rose 4 stories against the autumn sky, its windows broken or boarded, its roof sagging in sections that suggested serious water damage. Up close, the decay was even more evident. The warehouse had been built in the 1920s during tobacco's golden age, designed to store and cure thousands of pounds of leaf before shipment to cigarette manufacturers. It was industrial architecture at its most functional, thick brick walls, heavy timber framing, vast open floors where tobacco had once hung in careful rows. But decades of abandonment had taken their toll. Vegetation grew from cracks in the mortar, sections of brick had collapsed entirely, the loading dock where trucks had once delivered their harvest had rotted away to skeletal remnants. It's huge, Mia said, her voice carrying both awe and uncertainty. It's a wreck, Jacob corrected gently. But the bricks might be worth something, and the timber framing is probably old-growth oak that we could sell to salvage dealers. If I'm careful, if I work methodically, there might be enough here to build us something small but solid. They walked the perimeter carefully, Jacob assessing what could be salvaged and what was too damaged to save. The foundation was brick and stone, built to support massive weight, still solid despite years of neglect. The walls varied, some sections perfectly intact, others crumbling. The roof would have to come off carefully to avoid bringing down the walls with it. The main entrance was a heavy steel door that had been secured with a padlock at some point, though the lock was rusted through and fell apart when Jacob touched it. Inside, the warehouse was vast and shadowed, light filtering through broken windows and holes in the roof to illuminate dust particles dancing in the air. The smell was complex, old tobacco residue, mildew, the organic decay of materials slowly returning to earth. The main floor stretched out like a cathedral to commerce, maybe 15,000 square feet of open space beneath timber beams that had to be 2 feet square. Remnants of the curing process remained: metal hooks bolted to beams, old pulley systems, wooden racks that had once held tobacco leaves. The floor was poured concrete, cracked and stained but fundamentally sound. Stairs led to upper levels where more curing space had been, though Jacob could see daylight through the roof above, suggesting those floors were probably too damaged to safely explore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Can we explore upstairs? Mia asked, her curiosity fighting with the nervousness any sensible person felt entering a structure this deteriorated. Not until I've assessed whether it's safe. Maybe not at all if the floors are as rotted as they look. Jacob was already calculating, trying to figure out how to dismantle this building section by section without getting crushed when something inevitably collapsed. He'd done demolition work before, understood the basics of structural analysis, but this was beyond anything he'd tackled solo. They were about to leave when Mia noticed something that made her stop. "Dad, what's that?" She was pointing to the back corner of the warehouse, to what looked like a brick wall that didn't match the building's exterior walls. Jacob approached it carefully, his headlamp illuminating details the filtered daylight had obscured. The wall was definitely different, built from slightly smaller bricks, mortared with precision that suggested it had been added after the original construction, designed to seal off something that had been there before. Running his hands along the surface, Jacob found what felt like a seam. Not just a wall built against the warehouse's interior, but a wall built around something, enclosing it completely. He worked along the perimeter, finding the boundaries of the enclosure, realizing it was maybe 12 feet square, built floor to ceiling with the same careful precision throughout. Why would someone brick up part of the warehouse? Mia asked. I don't know. Storage maybe, or they were sealing off damage to the original structure. But even as Jacob said it, the explanation didn't quite fit. The brickwork was too careful, too complete, the enclosure too deliberately hidden in the warehouse's back corner. He spent the next hour examining the sealed space from every angle, finding no obvious entrance, no weakness in the construction, nothing that suggested easy access to whatever was inside. Someone had built this enclosure intending it to be permanent, to seal something away that they didn't want discovered easily. That evening, after taking Mia back to his sister's apartment, Jacob researched the warehouse's history. The Thornton family had owned it from 1927 through 1989, 3 generations processing tobacco through boom and bust, adapting to changing markets and regulations until the tobacco settlement had effectively destroyed their business model. The last Thornton to run the operation had been a man named Lawrence, who'd closed the warehouse in 1989 and died 6 months later at age 78. The property had bounced through several owners after that, a development company that went bankrupt before doing anything with it, an investor who'd planned to convert it to loft apartments before realizing the costs were prohibitive, finally the county seizing it for unpaid taxes and trying unsuccessfully to sell it for years before Jacob's desperate bid. But none of the historical records mentioned a sealed room, a bricked-up section, anything that explained what Jacob had found. He searched for building permits, renovation records, any documentation of construction work done inside the warehouse. Nothing matched what he'd seen. The next morning, Jacob returned to the warehouse alone, bringing tools and a plan to carefully open the sealed enclosure. If it contained just storage or structural bracing, he'd know what he was dealing with. If it contained something valuable, old equipment he could sell, materials worth salvaging, that would help offset his costs. He started in the corner where the brick seemed slightly less uniform, using a hammer and chisel to carefully remove mortar between bricks. The work was slow and dusty, each brick having to be extracted without damaging those around it if he wanted to maintain structural integrity. 2 hours in, he'd created a gap large enough to shine his headlamp through. What he saw made his breath catch. Not empty storage. Not structural bracing. A room, maybe 12 by 12, with a concrete floor and brick walls on all sides. And in the center of that room, illuminated by his headlamp beam, a massive iron vault, the kind used by banks before modern security systems, easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide. Jacob stood there processing this for a long moment. Someone had built a brick room inside the tobacco warehouse specifically to conceal a bank vault. Had sealed it so completely that casual inspection would never reveal it. Had hidden something they believed was worth protecting with that level of security and secrecy. He widened the opening enough to slip through, his headlamp revealing more details. The vault was old, probably from the same era as the warehouse itself, its surface showing the patina of decades but no obvious damage. A combination dial dominated the door's center, surrounded by brass fittings that had dulled with time. Engraved on a plate near the top was Mosler Safe Company, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1928. The vault door was closed, locked, and Jacob had no combination. But someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this, which meant whatever was inside had mattered enough to justify building a brick room around it and keeping it secret for, he counted years, at least 35 years, possibly much longer. He photographed everything with his phone, documented the vault and the enclosure, then carefully bricked up the opening he'd created. Whatever this was, it required more thought than impulse. He needed to understand who had hidden this and why before deciding how to proceed. Research over the next several days revealed that Lawrence Thornton had indeed purchased a Mosler vault in 1928, the same year the warehouse was built. Bank records from the era showed the transaction, though they didn't specify what the vault was used for. Tax records showed the warehouse had been properly assessed and taxed, but made no mention of valuable contents or anything that would explain why a tobacco processor needed bank-grade security. Jacob also discovered that the Thornton family had been more than just tobacco merchants. They'd been financial powerhouses in their day, had owned property throughout Stratford County, had served on bank boards and held influence in local government. Lawrence Thornton's father Edward had been a state senator in the 1930s, had connections to tobacco companies and agricultural interests throughout the South. But the family's fortunes had declined significantly after World War II. The records showed mounting debts, property sales, a slow erosion of wealth that accelerated in the 1980s when tobacco litigation began threatening the entire industry. By the time Lawrence closed the warehouse in 1989, the Thornton family was effectively bankrupt, their holdings liquidated to pay creditors, their influence reduced to historical footnote. Which raised questions. If the family had been wealthy, if they'd owned a vault, why had that vault never been mentioned in estate proceedings? Why had creditors not seized its contents during bankruptcy? How had it remained hidden through multiple property sales and county ownership? Jacob was still puzzling through this when his phone rang, Carl Hodges' name appearing on the screen. The auctioneer's voice was strange when Jacob answered, carrying excitement mixed with something that might have been concern. "Mr. Reese, I've had a visitor this morning. Woman named Dorothy Thornton, says she's Lawrence Thornton's granddaughter. She saw the auction notice for the warehouse and legal notices before the sale, didn't think anyone would actually buy it. Now she's very interested in discussing the property with you." "What does she want?" "She wouldn't say specifically. But Jacob, she offered me $5,000 for your contact information. When I told her I couldn't give that out without permission, she offered to pay you $10,000 for a meeting. Just a meeting, to discuss something about the warehouse that she says her grandfather told her about before he died. $10,000. Jacob's mind spun with what that money could do: pay his sister back for housing them, buy materials to build something livable, create the buffer he desperately needed. But he also knew that people didn't offer that kind of money just to chat unless they wanted something worth far more. "Tell her I'll meet with her. But here, at the warehouse, so she can see what she's asking about." Dorothy Thornton arrived the next afternoon in a new sedan that looked out of place in the warehouse's weedy parking lot. She was maybe 45, well-dressed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone used to getting what she wanted. But her expression when she looked at the deteriorating warehouse was complicated, grief and anger and something that might have been relief all mixing together. "My grandfather died in 1989 believing everything he'd built was lost," she said after introducing herself, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd grown up with money even if the family fortune was gone. "He spent his last months watching creditors pick apart the tobacco business, selling off property and equipment, liquidating everything to pay debts the tobacco settlement created. He died broken, convinced his family's legacy was destroyed. I'm sorry for your loss, Jacob said carefully. But that was over 30 years ago. What brings you here now? Dorothy turned to face him fully, her expression showing calculation mixed with desperation. Because 3 days before he died, my grandfather told me something. He said the warehouse held one final asset, something he'd kept secret from creditors, something that could restore the family if whoever found it understood its value and had the integrity not to just steal it. She paused. He never told me exactly what it was or where to find it. Just that it was there, hidden, and that eventually someone would buy the warehouse for salvage and discover what he'd protected. And you think I've found it? Carl Hodges said you paid $415 for a building nobody wanted. You're either desperate or you know something. Either way, I'm betting you've been inside, been looking around, maybe found something that doesn't make sense for a tobacco warehouse to contain. Jacob made a decision to trust her, or at least to trust enough to test whether her story aligned with what he'd found. There's a vault. Hidden behind a brick wall in the back corner, concealed so well that I only found it because I was looking at salvage potential. Mossler safe from 1928, locked, no combination that I know of. Dorothy's expression showed vindication mixed with fear. My grandfather mentioned a combination once, made me memorize it because he said I might need it someday. But he never told me what it opened or where to find it. Just numbers, right 42, left 17, right 63, and the instruction that if I ever found what those numbers unlocked, I should be very careful about who I told. They stood in the warehouse's shadowed interior, surrounded by decades of decay, discussing a vault that had been hidden for 35 years and might contain something that had been worth protecting through bankruptcy and death. Jacob felt the weight of decisions pressing on him, understanding that whatever came next would define not just his financial future but his character when tested by circumstances that made right and easy diverge. If we open it, he said carefully, if there's something valuable inside, we need to be clear about ownership and intentions before we proceed. I bought this property legally. Whatever's in that vault is legally mine unless you can prove otherwise. Dorothy's expression hardened slightly, showing the steel beneath her polished exterior. My grandfather protected that vault's contents through bankruptcy proceedings, kept it secret from creditors who would have seized anything they could find. If you think I'm just going to hand over my family's last legacy to someone who bought the warehouse for scrap, you're mistaken. And if you think I'm going to give you access to something on my property without clear understanding of what happens next, you're equally mistaken. Jacob kept his voice level. So let's figure out what we're dealing with before we start fighting over it. You have the combination. I have access. We open it together, document what's inside, then make decisions about next steps with full information instead of assumptions. They spent the next hour negotiating terms, how they'd open the vault, who would be present, what would happen if the contents were valuable versus worthless, how disputes would be resolved. Finally, they agreed on a framework that felt fair if not comfortable, and Dorothy called her lawyer to draw up a simple agreement that protected both their interests. The brick wall came down over 2 days, Jacob working carefully to create an opening large enough to access the vault while maintaining structural integrity. Dorothy returned each day to watch progress, her anxiety evident in the way she paced and checked her phone, her investment in this clearly going beyond simple financial interest. On the 3rd day, with the vault fully accessible, they stood before it together, Dorothy holding a flashlight while Jacob worked the combination she'd provided. Right 42, left 17, right 63. The dial turned smoothly despite decades of disuse, the mechanism inside clicking with precision that spoke to quality craftsmanship from an era when safes were built to last generations. The final number clicked into place, and Jacob pulled the handle. For a moment the door resisted, then swung open with surprising smoothness, revealing the vault's interior for the first time in 35 years. What they found inside wasn't gold bars or cash or jewelry. It was documents. Hundreds of files, carefully organized, preserved in waterproof containers that had protected them from humidity and time. Jacob pulled out the first container, opened it, found himself looking at what appeared to be ledgers from the 1950s and 60s, detailed accounting records showing financial transactions involving the Thornton tobacco business. But as he looked closer, as Dorothy examined other containers, the pattern became clear and troubling. These weren't just business records. They were evidence, documentation of a systematic fraud scheme that had operated for decades, involving tobacco companies, government officials, agricultural cooperatives, and the Thornton family at the center of it all. Lawrence Thornton hadn't hidden a fortune in his vault. He'd hidden testimony that implicated dozens of powerful people in crimes ranging from tax fraud to price fixing to bribery of state officials. He documented everything with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that someday this evidence might be the only thing standing between truth and comfortable lies that would let guilty people escape consequence. Dorothy sank to the floor, her face pale as she read through documents that destroyed everything she believed about her family legacy. "Oh God," she whispered. He wasn't protecting assets. He was protecting evidence. Evidence that he was part of something criminal, that our family's wealth was built on fraud. Jacob continued examining the files, finding more damning material with each container he opened. Letters showing Thornton coordination with tobacco company executives to suppress health research. Financial records documenting systematic underpayment of farmers who sold their crops through Thornton warehouses. Evidence of kickbacks paid to agricultural officials who directed government contracts to Thornton-affiliated businesses. And running through all of it, detailed documentation of how Lawrence Thornton had participated in this fraud while simultaneously documenting it, creating a comprehensive record that explained exactly how the scheme worked, who benefited, and how much money had been stolen from farmers and taxpayers over decades. The final container held a letter, dated 1989, written in shaky handwriting that suggested a man whose time was running out. "To whoever finds this vault, I am dying with more regret than any man should carry, having built my life on fraud I participated in and then documented with the coward's calculation that evidence might someday protect me if the scheme was exposed. It wasn't virtue that made me keep these records, it was insurance, the belief that powerful people would protect me if I had evidence that could implicate them alongside me. But the tobacco settlement destroyed that protection, made all of us vulnerable to consequences we'd avoided for decades. My business is bankrupt, my wealth seized by creditors, and I'm dying knowing that everything I built was corruption dressed up as commerce. I've hidden this evidence not to protect the guilty but because I'm still a coward, still too afraid to speak truth while alive, even though silence means farmers who were cheated will never get compensation, officials who took bribes will never face consequences, and the tobacco companies that orchestrated this will continue denying what they knew and when they knew it. If you found this, you have a choice I lack the courage to make. You can destroy this evidence, let the past stay buried, protect the reputations of people who don't deserve protection. Or you can bring it forward, force accountability even though it comes decades late, give the people who were cheated some measure of justice even if it's too late for full restoration. I'm asking you to do what I couldn't, to choose truth over convenience, to honor the people who were harmed even though honoring them will damage powerful interests that would prefer comfortable silence. The Thornton family built wealth on fraud. The tobacco companies built fortunes on lies. The government officials who enabled this escaped consequence through retirement or death. None of us deserve to escape accountability, but we did because victims had no evidence and no one cared enough to dig for truth. Do better than we did. Make this evidence matter. Give the people we cheated the dignity of acknowledgement even if compensation is impossible. That's the only legacy worth claiming from the wreckage of what we built. Lawrence Thornton, 1989. They sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by evidence of crimes committed before either of them was born, facing the weight of decisions about whether and how to bring forward truth that would complicate lives and reputations decades after the frauds occurred. Finally, Dorothy spoke, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose understanding of her family had just been shattered. My grandfather was a criminal. Built his fortune by cheating farmers and bribing officials and participating in schemes that made tobacco companies richer while the people who actually grew tobacco got poorer. She looked at Jacob. And now I have to decide whether to protect his reputation or honor the people he harmed. Jacob thought about his own situation, about the $415 he'd spent on this warehouse, about the choice he'd made to meet with Dorothy instead of just opening the vault alone and taking whatever was inside. He'd chosen transparency when hiding would have been easier, chosen collaboration when exclusion would have been simpler. Lawrence's letter asks whoever found this to make the evidence matter, he said carefully. To give the people who were cheated acknowledgement even if compensation is impossible. That seems like the right choice, even though it's not the easy one. You understand what bringing this forward means? The Thornton family name will be destroyed. People who remember my grandfather as a respected businessman will learn he was a fraud. Any lingering goodwill toward our family will evaporate. But the farmers who were cheated will finally know it wasn't their failure or their fault, will have documentation that the system was rigged against them. The officials who took bribes might face some consequence even if it's just historical record. The tobacco companies will have to acknowledge one more piece of evidence showing they knew their product was deadly and chose profit over truth. Jacob paused. Your grandfather spent decades protecting this evidence while lacking courage to use it. Maybe that's the real legacy, not the fraud, but the fact that eventually he wanted accountability even if he couldn't pursue it himself. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, her hands shaking as she held documents that destroyed her family's mythology. Finally, she nodded. We bring it forward. Contact prosecutors, historical societies, whoever would care about evidence of systematic fraud in the tobacco industry. Let them decide what to do with it, but at least make sure it's not hidden anymore. Over the next several weeks, they worked with state prosecutors and agricultural historians to assess the vault's contents. The evidence was explosive, detailed documentation of crimes that had enriched tobacco companies and middlemen while systematically cheating the farmers who actually grew the crop. Names of officials who'd taken bribes, records of farmers who'd been underpaid, evidence of price-fixing schemes that had operated for decades. Most of the individuals implicated were dead, beyond legal consequence. But some were still alive, retired and respected, their reputations built on fraud they'd never been held accountable for. The tobacco companies involved still existed, still denied knowledge of health risks and still fought liability claims from sick former smokers. The documentation Lawrence Thornton had hidden provided one more piece of evidence showing the industry's systematic dishonesty. The story made national news when prosecutors announced they were reviewing the evidence for potential charges against surviving participants. The Thornton name, which Dorothy had hoped to restore, was indeed destroyed, though not in the way she'd feared. Lawrence became known not as a successful businessman but as a criminal who'd at least had enough conscience to document his crimes, even if he'd lacked courage to expose them while alive. Jacob found himself at the center of attention he'd never sought, fielding calls from journalists and historians, explaining how he'd bought a condemned warehouse for salvage and found instead evidence that would reshape understanding of tobacco industry fraud. The $10,000 Dorothy had offered for the initial meeting seemed almost quaint compared to the value of what they'd found, not monetary value, but historical significance that would help people understand systematic injustices that had operated for generations. But the warehouse still needed dealing with. Jacob couldn't afford to maintain it, couldn't justify keeping a deteriorating structure just because it had yielded important evidence. He began the salvage work he'd originally planned, carefully dismantling sections while preserving the vault room as potential historical exhibit. Dorothy surprised him 3 months after they'd opened the vault, appearing at the warehouse with a proposal that showed she'd been thinking carefully about legacy and restoration. My family built wealth through fraud, she said. I can't undo that, can't compensate everyone who was cheated. But I can use what remains of the Thornton estate to create something that honors the people my grandfather harmed. She'd established a foundation focused on helping small tobacco farmers transition to other crops, providing resources and support for families trying to leave an industry that had exploited them for generations. The foundation would also fund research into agricultural fraud and create archives documenting how systematic cheating had operated in tobacco markets for decades. It's not restitution, Dorothy acknowledged. The people my grandfather cheated are mostly dead, and the money I'm using was built on fraud anyway. But it's what I can do, take wealth created through dishonesty and redirect it toward helping the communities that were harmed. The tobacco warehouse was eventually demolished, carefully taken apart piece by piece, the valuable materials sold to fund the foundation Dorothy had created. But the vault room was preserved, relocated to a museum in the state capitol where it stood as testament to both the crimes committed and the eventual revelation that brought them to light. Jacob used his salvage proceeds to build the small house he'd planned, giving himself and Mia the independence and stability they'd been missing. The work had taken 6 months of careful dismantling, had yielded enough material to fund not just their house but also a financial buffer that made unexpected expenses manageable rather than catastrophic. But more than the money or the house, the experience had taught him something about choices and consequences. He could have opened the vault alone, could have taken whatever was inside without telling Dorothy or anyone else, could have prioritized his own need over consideration of who else had claims or interests. Instead, he'd chosen transparency, had collaborated rather than concealed, had made decisions that honored complexity rather than just pursuing personal benefit. That choice had led to revelation rather than profit, to historical justice rather than personal enrichment, to outcomes nobody could have predicted when he'd paid $415 for a warehouse nobody wanted. Lawrence Thornton's hidden evidence had reshaped understanding of tobacco industry fraud, had given families who'd been cheated acknowledgement even though compensation was impossible, had created a record that made denial harder for companies still fighting liability claims. Mia, now 13, had watched all of this unfold with the careful attention of a child learning what integrity looked like when tested by real circumstances. "You could have kept it all secret," she said one evening while they were eating dinner in the house Jacob had built from salvage materials. "Could have just taken whatever was valuable and never told anyone about the documents." "I could have," Jacob agreed. "But your grandfather's letter asked whoever found the vault to do better than he did, to choose truth over convenience. Seemed like that request deserved honoring. Even though it meant you didn't get rich?" "Even though. Because getting rich by hiding evidence of crimes isn't really getting rich, it's just being one more person who chose comfort over doing right. Your grandfather did that for decades and died full of regret. I didn't want to die carrying that kind of weight." The years passed, each one adding distance from that November day when Jacob had bought a condemned warehouse and the auctioneer had laughed at his desperate bid. The foundation Dorothy had created continued operating, helping tobacco farming families transition to sustainable alternatives, documenting the history of agricultural fraud that had operated for generations. The vault sat in its museum display, its contents available to researchers and historians studying how systematic dishonesty had shaped entire industries. Jacob's construction and salvage work evolved into a business focused on historic preservation and adaptive reuse, helping communities save old buildings rather than demolishing them. He developed expertise in assessing structures people thought were worthless, finding value in materials and methods modern construction had abandoned. The tobacco warehouse had been his first major project, had taught him to look beyond obvious decay to see what might be preserved or revealed. Dorothy became an advocate for agricultural transparency and fraud prevention, using her family's story as cautionary tale about how systematic dishonesty corrupted entire industries. She spoke at conferences and wrote about the importance of documentation and accountability, about how her grandfather's hidden evidence had eventually served the truth he'd been too afraid to speak while alive. 5 years after finding the vault, Jacob received a letter from a tobacco farming family in another county. They'd read about the Thornton documents, had recognized the description of fraudulent practices, realized their own grandfather had been one of the farmers systematically cheated through underweight scales and falsified grades. The evidence Lawrence Thornton had hidden had given them answers to questions they'd carried for generations: why their family farm had never prospered despite hard work, why their grandfather had died broke despite growing crops that made others wealthy. "Your discovery gave us truth we'd been missing," the letter read. "Can't change the past, can't recover what was stolen, but at least now we know it wasn't our failure. The system was rigged, and your choice to bring that evidence forward instead of hiding it gave us that understanding. Thank you." Jacob showed the letter to Mia, now 17 and preparing for college, watching her read it with the thoughtful expression she wore when processing complicated ideas. "That's what Grandpa Thornton meant about making the evidence matter," she said. "Not just exposing crimes, but giving people understanding about why their lives were hard even when they did everything right. Yeah. Sometimes the most important thing you can give people is truth that explains their experience, validation that their struggles weren't their fault. Jacob paused. That's worth more than anything I could have gained by keeping the vault secret. The tobacco warehouse was long gone, its materials dispersed to other projects, its land sold to someone who'd built a community garden on the site where fraud had once been planned and eventually exposed. But the vault remained, a physical reminder that buried things eventually surface, that silence eventually breaks, that the ground remembers everything and gives up its secrets when circumstances bring the right person to the right place at the right time. Lawrence Thornton had died believing his legacy was destroyed, his crimes hidden, his participation in systematic fraud safely concealed from consequences. But his final act, documenting evidence and trusting that whoever found it would do what he couldn't, had created possibilities for accountability he'd been too afraid to pursue while living. His cowardice in life had been partially redeemed by his faith that eventually someone would be braver, would choose revelation over concealment, would honor the people harmed even when doing so offered no personal benefit. Jacob had been that someone, not through heroism but through the simple calculation that transparency was better than deception, that collaboration was wiser than concealment, that truth mattered even when lies would have been more profitable. He'd bought a warehouse for $415 seeking salvage material, had found instead evidence that reshaped historical understanding and gave families answers they'd sought for generations. 10 years after the auctioneer's laughter had echoed across an empty parking lot, after $415 had bought a warehouse nobody wanted, after a hidden vault had revealed evidence powerful people preferred to stay buried, Jacob stood in the museum where the Mosler safe was displayed. School groups came through regularly, students learning about agricultural fraud and systematic dishonesty, about how Lawrence Thornton had documented crimes he participated in and how eventually that documentation had served truth even though it came decades late. The display included the letter Thornton had left, his final request that whoever found the evidence should do better than he'd done, should choose accountability over concealment. It included documentation of the fraud itself, the scope and scale of systematic cheating that had operated for decades. And it included the story of how a desperate man buying a condemned warehouse had found the vault and made the choice to bring its contents forward rather than hiding them for personal gain. Mia was with him, home from college where she was studying social justice and agricultural policy, her career path shaped by childhood proximity to revelations about systematic fraud and eventual accountability. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, standing before the vault display. "Not keeping the evidence hidden, not using it for leverage or selling it or something that would have benefited us more directly?" Jacob thought about this honestly, remembering the desperation of that November day, the $415 that represented his last attempt to create stability. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices. But mostly no. Because bringing that evidence forward created something that mattered more than personal profit, it gave people truth, created accountability even if it came late, honored victims of fraud even though compensation was impossible. That was worth more than anything I could have gained by staying silent." They left the museum as evening settled over the city, walking past displays that told stories of complicated histories and difficult revelations, past artifacts that marked moments when silence gave way to truth. The vault stood among them, its door open permanently now, its contents transformed from hidden evidence to public record, its purpose fulfilled through revelation rather than continued concealment. The land where the tobacco warehouse had stood was miles away, transformed into something that grew vegetables instead of hiding fraud, that served community rather than protecting powerful interests. But the memory of what had been found there persisted, in museum displays and historical records, in foundation work that helped farming families, in the understanding that systematic dishonesty eventually faced accountability when brave people chose revelation over comfortable silence. Jacob had been one of those people, not through any special virtue but through the accumulated weight of choices made when circumstances tested whether he'd honor truth or pursue convenience. He'd bought a warehouse seeking salvage, had found instead buried testimony, had chosen to make that testimony matter rather than hiding it for personal benefit. That choice had defined him more than any amount of money could have, had shaped his daughter's understanding of integrity and accountability, had created ripples that extended far beyond the $415 that started everything. The auctioneer had laughed at his desperate bid, but that bid had led to revelation that reshaped historical understanding and gave victims' families the acknowledgement they'd been denied for generations. Lawrence Thornton had hidden evidence and hoped that eventually someone would find it and do what he couldn't: speak truth that implicated powerful people, honor victims of fraud even when doing so offered no personal reward, choose accountability over the comfortable silence that let guilty people escape consequence. Jacob had been that someone, had made that choice, had fulfilled the trust a dying man placed in whoever was desperate or thorough enough to find what had been concealed. The vault's opening had been the beginning of revelation, not the end. 10 years of research and documentation and accountability had followed, reshaping understanding of how agricultural fraud had operated, giving families answers to questions they'd carried across generations, creating foundations that helped communities escape industries that had exploited them. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you chose to reveal, not what served your interests but what served truth even when truth was difficult and offered no personal benefit. The warehouse was gone, its materials dispersed, its land repurposed. But what had been found there persisted, in historical records and museum displays, in foundation work and family understanding, in the knowledge that buried things eventually surface when circumstances bring someone willing to look and brave enough to reveal what they find. Jacob's life had stabilized in ways that seemed almost miraculous compared to that desperate November. The salvage business had become historic preservation work, had provided security and purpose, had created the kind of financial stability that made unexpected challenges manageable rather than catastrophic. Mia had grown into a young woman whose understanding of justice and accountability had been shaped by watching her father choose truth over convenience, revelation over concealment, integrity over profit. They drove home through the evening, past fields that had once grown tobacco and now grew other crops, past barns that remembered the industry's heyday and its eventual reckoning, past land that held stories of fraud and revelation, of crimes committed and eventually exposed, of silence that persisted until someone cared enough to speak truth that powerful interests preferred to stay buried. The tobacco warehouse had stood for decades concealing evidence that eventually changed historical understanding and created accountability decades delayed but finally achieved. Lawrence Thornton's cowardice in life had been partially redeemed by his final act of documenting crimes and trusting that eventually someone would honor victims he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Jacob had honored that trust, had chosen revelation over concealment, had made the evidence matter in ways that served justice even though it offered no personal enrichment. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy built through choice rather than inheritance, truth revealed rather than comfortable lies maintained, accountability achieved even when it came decades too late to fully restore what fraud had stolen. The vault stood open in its museum home, its secrets told, its contents serving the purpose Lawrence Thornton had hoped for even though he'd lacked courage to pursue that purpose while living. And somewhere, tobacco farming families who'd been systematically cheated finally had answers, finally understood that their struggles hadn't been their failure, finally knew that the system had been rigged and that eventually someone had cared enough to expose that truth. That understanding couldn't restore what had been stolen, couldn't compensate for decades of fraud. But it gave them dignity of acknowledgement, validation that their experiences were real and their suspicions justified. The land remembered everything, the fraud committed and the evidence hidden and the revelation that brought truth forward after decades of concealment. The tobacco warehouse was gone, but what it had held persisted in ways that mattered more than brick and timber. Truth had surfaced, silence had broken, and families who'd been cheated finally had the recognition they deserved even if full justice remained impossible. Jacob had made that possible not through heroism but through simple choices, to be transparent rather than deceptive, to collaborate rather than conceal, to honor truth even when lies would have been more profitable. Those choices had defined his character more surely than any fortune could have, had shaped his daughter's understanding of integrity, had created ripples that extended far beyond the $415 that bought a warehouse nobody wanted and revealed evidence nobody expected to find. The auctioneer's laughter had marked the beginning of something neither of them understood at the time, not just a desperate bid on condemned property, but the first step in a journey that would resurrect buried evidence and create accountability that powerful interests had thought safely hidden. That journey was complete now, its purpose fulfilled, its truth told. The warehouse was gone, but the vault remained, standing as testament that some secrets can't stay buried forever, that silence eventually breaks, and that sometimes desperate people stumbling into hidden evidence make choices that honor truth even when convenience would have been easier. The foundation Dorothy established operated from a renovated farmhouse on the outskirts of Stratford County, its rooms filled with resources for tobacco farming families trying to transition to sustainable alternatives. Jacob visited occasionally, watching the work that had grown from Lawrence Thornton's hidden evidence, seeing how revelation of systematic fraud had created something constructive rather than just exposing historical crimes. The families who came seeking help carried stories that echoed across generations. Grandparents who'd worked tobacco fields until their bodies gave out, who'd died broke despite decades of labor. Parents who'd watched the industry collapse and couldn't understand why they'd never prospered even in tobacco's heyday. Children now grown who were trying to break cycles of poverty rooted in systematic cheating they hadn't known existed until the Thornton documents provided explanation. One afternoon, Jacob encountered a man named Robert Hayes at the Foundation's Resource Center, studying materials about crop diversification and sustainable farming. Robert was maybe 60, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working land, and the tired eyes of someone carrying burdens he couldn't quite name. "My daddy grew tobacco for 40 years, Robert said after they'd started talking, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone used to thinking before speaking. "Worked harder than any man I knew, but we were always broke, always struggling, always one bad season from losing everything. He died believing he'd failed, that he wasn't good enough at farming to make it work." The Thornton documents changed that understanding? Jacob asked gently. "Showed me the scales were rigged. Literally, they'd adjust the weights so 1,000 pounds tested as 900, pocket the difference, and my daddy never knew he was being cheated every single harvest." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he held the documentation. "Can't get that money back, can't restore the years he worked himself to death for wages that should have been higher. But at least now I know it wasn't his failure. The system was designed to steal from people like him." Jacob listened as Robert described growing up poor in a community of tobacco farmers who were all poor despite working profitable crops, who'd blamed themselves for poverty that was actually systematic theft. The Thornton evidence had given Robert and families like his an explanation that shifted shame from personal failure to structural injustice. "Your discovery of that vault, that changed my understanding of my whole childhood," Robert said. "Changed how I remember my daddy, changed what I tell my own kids about why their grandfather died broke. That matters more than any amount of money could." After Robert left, Jacob sat with Dorothy in her office, both of them quiet with the weight of stories like Robert's, with the understanding that Lawrence Thornton's hidden evidence had created ripples that continued extending years after the vault was opened. "We get people like Robert every week," Dorothy said, her voice tired but carrying satisfaction. "Families who've wondered for decades why they couldn't make tobacco farming work, who blamed themselves for poverty that was actually theft. The foundation can't compensate them financially, but it can give them truth that explains their experience. That's worth something. Your grandfather would be surprised that his hidden evidence created this," Jacob observed. "Maybe. Or maybe he knew that documentation could serve purposes beyond just protecting himself from prosecution. Maybe hiding those records while requesting that whoever found them should use them for accountability, maybe that was his way of trying to build something good from the fraud he'd participated in." Dorothy paused. "He died a coward, but at least he died hoping for redemption through whoever was brave enough to do what he couldn't." The Foundation's work expanded over the following years, partnering with agricultural colleges and economic development agencies to help tobacco farming communities diversify. The programs they created provided technical assistance, financial planning, market connections, all the resources families needed to transition from a dying industry that had exploited them to sustainable alternatives that offered genuine economic opportunity. Mia interned at the Foundation during college breaks, working directly with farming families, helping them navigate the complex process of transitioning crops and markets. Jacob watched his daughter develop expertise in agricultural economics and rural development, saw how the experience of being 12 years old when her father found hidden evidence had shaped her entire educational and professional trajectory. I used to think farming was just about growing things, Mia told him one evening after a particularly difficult day at the foundation. But it's really about power: who controls markets, who sets prices, who decides what information farmers have access to. The Thornton fraud worked because farmers didn't know they were being cheated, didn't have the information or leverage to demand fair treatment. And the foundation's work is about changing that power imbalance, Jacob said. Exactly. We can't undo the historical fraud, can't compensate all the families who were cheated. But we can give current farmers the tools and knowledge they need to avoid being exploited going forward. That's legacy too, taking what was learned from past injustice and using it to prevent future injustice. The museum exhibit featuring the Thornton Vault became a traveling display, visiting agricultural communities throughout the South, telling the story of systematic fraud and eventual revelation. Jacob was invited to speak at several openings, describing the experience of buying a condemned warehouse for salvage and discovering instead evidence that reshaped historical understanding. At one such event in rural North Carolina, an elderly woman approached him after his presentation. She was maybe 80, moving slowly with a cane, her face showing the kind of weathering that came from decades of outdoor work and hard living. "I'm Martha Reed," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "My husband was one of the tobacco farmers the Thornton organization cheated. He died in 1985, died believing he'd failed at farming because we could never get ahead no matter how hard we worked." She paused, her eyes bright with tears. "Finding out 50 years later that the failure wasn't his, that the system was rigged, that's a gift, Mr. Reese. A gift you gave us by choosing to reveal that evidence instead of hiding it." Jacob felt the weight of her gratitude, understanding that his choice to bring forward the vault's contents had given people like Martha something money couldn't buy: validation that their suspicions were justified, that their struggles weren't their fault, that the system had been deliberately designed to exploit them. "Your husband deserved better than he got," Jacob said. "All the farmers who were cheated deserved better. I'm sorry the truth came too late for him to know it. But I know it now. And I can tell my grandchildren their grandfather wasn't a failure, was actually a victim of systematic fraud. That changes how they understand their family history, changes the story we tell about who we are and why we struggled." Martha reached out and squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for not keeping that evidence hidden. Thank you for choosing to honor people you'd never met over whatever personal benefit you could have gained from silence." The encounters accumulated over years, farming families expressing gratitude for truth that came decades late but still mattered, researchers thanking him for evidence that filled gaps in historical understanding, journalists and documentarians wanting to tell the story of how a condemned warehouse had yielded proof of systematic agricultural fraud. Jacob's salvage and preservation business grew, built partly on expertise he'd developed dismantling the tobacco warehouse but more significantly on reputation for integrity that came from his handling of the vault discovery. Clients knew he could be trusted with complicated situations, that he'd prioritize doing right over maximizing profit, that transparency and collaboration would characterize his work. He hired Robert Hayes to help with agricultural building preservation, creating a specialty in saving old tobacco barns and warehouses, transforming them into homes or event spaces or storage facilities that honored their history while serving modern needs. Robert brought expertise in tobacco architecture and understanding of farming communities, helped Jacob navigate the complicated emotional terrain of preserving buildings that represented both agricultural heritage and systematic exploitation. "My daddy worked in buildings like this," Robert said one afternoon while they were assessing a tobacco barn similar to the one where the vault had been hidden. "Spend harvest seasons hanging leaf, breathing dust, working equipment that was dangerous and poorly maintained. These buildings represent his labor and his exploitation both, can't separate the two. So how do we preserve them in ways that honor both truths?" Jacob asked. "Tell the whole story. When we convert these to other uses, we include information about what happened here. Not just the agricultural process, but the economics, how farmers were paid, how the system worked, what the Thornton evidence revealed about systematic cheating. Make the buildings serve as teaching tools, not just nostalgic monuments to an industry that exploited the people who made it profitable." They developed a model for preservation that included historical interpretation, working with local communities to document not just tobacco's agricultural history but its economic reality. The barns they saved became community centers and educational facilities. Their preserved tobacco curing equipment displayed alongside information about how farmers were systematically underpaid, how the industry suppressed health research, how people like Lawrence Thornton participated in fraud while living respectable lives. 15 years after finding the vault, Jacob received an invitation to speak at a major agricultural history conference, presenting on the long-term impact of the Thornton evidence. He brought Mia, now working full-time for the foundation Dorothy had established, both of them preparing a presentation that connected the discovery to ongoing work helping farming communities. The conference hall was packed with academics and agricultural professionals, people who'd been studying tobacco history for decades and who recognized the Thornton documents as game-changing evidence that confirmed suspicions about systematic fraud. Jacob's presentation focused not on the discovery itself but on what had followed: the foundation's creation, the museum exhibits, the preservation work that honored complicated history, the families who'd finally gotten answers about why they'd struggled despite hard work. During the question period, a professor from a state agricultural college asked the question Jacob had been expecting. Do you ever regret not keeping the vault's contents secret? The monetary value of that evidence to tobacco litigation lawyers alone would have been substantial. You could have sold it for millions, lived very comfortably while someone else dealt with the moral complexity of bringing it forward. Jacob considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest about temptation while explaining the choice he'd made. I thought about keeping it secret, especially in those first days when I was still desperate for money and didn't know if revealing the evidence would cost me everything. But Lawrence Thornton's letter asked whoever found the vault to do better than he'd done, to choose accountability over concealment. That request felt like it deserved honoring, even though honoring it meant I didn't personally profit from the discovery. But you did profit, another audience member pointed out. Your business grew, you developed reputation for integrity, you've made a living from work that grew out of the warehouse discovery. True, Jacob acknowledged. But those profits came from choosing transparency and doing right, not from hiding evidence or prioritizing personal benefit over broader considerations. The business success followed from the choice to collaborate with Dorothy Thornton and bring the evidence forward properly, rather than from trying to extract maximum personal value from what I'd found. Mia spoke up from beside him. My dad could have opened that vault alone, taken whatever was inside, hidden the evidence, and we'd never have known what we'd missed. Instead, he chose to involve the Thornton family, to document everything properly, to make decisions that honored complexity rather than just pursuing personal interest. That choice created the foundation I work for, created the preservation model we've developed, created outcomes that serve communities rather than just enriching one person who happened to find hidden evidence. After the conference, after the presentations and the networking and the conversations with researchers who'd been studying the Thornton documents for years, Jacob and Mia drove back to Stratford County through farmland that had once grown tobacco and now grew other crops. The landscape had changed over 15 years, the tobacco barns increasingly repurposed or falling into decay, the communities adapting to economic realities the settlement had created. Do you think Grandpa Thornton imagined any of this? Mia asked as they drove past a restored tobacco barn that now housed a farm-to-table restaurant. The foundation, the museum exhibits, the preservation work, all of it. I think he hoped for accountability but couldn't imagine the specific forms it would take, Jacob said. He died in 1989 believing his world was ending, that everything he'd built was being destroyed by the tobacco settlement. Couldn't have predicted that his hidden evidence would eventually help create something constructive from the wreckage. He must have been so alone at the end. Keeping those secrets, knowing what he'd participated in, unable to speak truth but hoping someone eventually would. That's what the letter suggested, that he wanted redemption through whoever found the vault, wanted his evidence to serve justice even though he'd lacked courage to pursue justice himself. Jacob paused, thinking about the burden Lawrence Thornton had carried. We gave him that redemption, by choosing to use the evidence the way he'd hoped rather than hiding it or using it just for personal gain. Dorothy Thornton's health declined in the 18th year after the vault was opened, cancer aggressive enough that doctors gave her months rather than years. She called Jacob to the foundation office one afternoon, her appearance showing the toll of treatment, her determination still evident despite physical weakness. "I'm making arrangements for the foundation's continuation after I'm gone," she said without preamble. "Setting up governance that ensures the work continues, that families still get the support they need, that my grandfather's evidence keeps serving the purpose we gave it." "I'm sorry you're dealing with this," Jacob said, the words inadequate but sincere. "I'm not sorry. I've had 18 years to build something meaningful from my grandfather's crimes, to transform shame into service, to honor the people he harmed in ways that matter more than any apology could." Dorothy paused, gathering strength. "When we opened that vault, when we saw what Lawrence had hidden, I thought my family's legacy was destroyed. But you helped me understand that legacy isn't just what you inherit, it's what you choose to build from what you've been given. You built something remarkable. The foundation, the research programs, the support for farming families, all of it serves people your grandfather harmed. Because you made the choice to reveal the evidence instead of hiding it, because you collaborated rather than excluding me, because you honored the complexity rather than just taking what benefited you personally." Dorothy's eyes were bright with tears. "My grandfather died hoping for redemption. You and I gave him that, by making his evidence matter in ways that served justice even though it came decades too late." Dorothy died 6 weeks later, surrounded by family, her final instructions ensuring the foundation would continue operating long after she was gone. Her funeral drew hundreds, farming families the foundation had helped, researchers who'd studied the Thornton evidence, preservation professionals who'd worked on tobacco barn conversions, community members who'd watched her transform family shame into public service. Jacob spoke at the service, describing how Dorothy could have hidden from her grandfather's crimes, could have denied or minimized the fraud he'd participated in, could have protected the Thornton name rather than acknowledging difficult truth. Instead, she chose accountability. Chose to build something that honored her grandfather's victims, chose to use family resources to help communities he'd harmed. That was courage, and that was character, and that was legacy chosen rather than inherited. The foundation continued under new leadership, its programs expanding to serve farming communities throughout the region. Mia eventually became executive director, bringing expertise in agricultural economics and deep understanding of how systematic fraud had shaped rural poverty for generations. The work remained focused on helping tobacco farming families transition to sustainable alternatives, but it also created broader programs addressing agricultural injustice and economic exploitation. 20 years after Jacob had paid $415 for a condemned warehouse, after he'd found a hidden vault and made the choice to reveal its contents rather than concealing them, he stood in the museum where the Mosler safe was displayed. The exhibit had evolved over 2 decades, adding context and detail, incorporating research that had emerged from the evidence Lawrence Thornton had hidden. New sections documented the broader scope of tobacco industry fraud, showing how the Thornton scheme was one piece of systematic dishonesty that had operated throughout the South for decades. Other sections told stories of specific farming families who'd been cheated, giving names and faces to people who'd been reduced to statistics. Interactive displays allowed visitors to calculate how much money their own families might have lost if they'd sold tobacco through warehouses that used rigged scales and falsified grades. But the centerpiece remained the vault itself, its door permanently open, Lawrence Thornton's letter displayed alongside documentation of his crimes and his eventual request for accountability. The exhibit didn't shy away from complexity, it showed Lawrence as both perpetrator of fraud and documenter of evidence, both coward who'd lacked courage to speak truth while alive and man who'd hoped someone eventually would. Jacob brought his grandson, Owen's son, named Lawrence at Mia's suggestion, to see the exhibit on the boy's 8th birthday. Lawrence asked questions with the curiosity of children trying to understand complicated adult concepts, wanted to know why the vault had been hidden and why revealing it mattered and what happened to the people who'd been cheated. Sometimes people do wrong things and then hide evidence of those wrong things, Jacob explained, kneeling to the boy's eye level. But sometimes they also hope that eventually the truth will come out, that someone will find what they hid and make it matter. That's what happened with this vault. Mr. Thornton did bad things, but he documented them and left a letter asking whoever found his documentation to use it for good. And you found it, Lawrence said, studying his great-grandfather with the seriousness children adopt when learning family stories. I did. When I was very poor and very desperate, I bought a broken building hoping to sell its parts. Instead, I found evidence that helped people understand why their families had struggled, that created programs to help farming communities, that gave truth to people who'd been lied to for decades. Was that better than selling the building parts? Jacob smiled at the question's directness. Much better. The building parts would have given me money for a little while. The evidence created something that's still helping people 20 years later, that will keep helping people long after I'm gone. That's more valuable than any amount of money. The boy thought about this, then asked another question with the stunning clarity children sometimes achieve. Did it make you happy? Finding the vault and doing the good thing instead of the money thing? It made me feel like I'd honored something important. Like I'd done what was right even though it was hard. That's different from happy maybe, but it's better. It's knowing you made choices you can be proud of when you look back. As they walked through the rest of the exhibit, reading about farming families and systematic fraud and the long journey from crime to accountability, Jacob thought about the path that had started with desperate $415 and had led to this moment. The warehouse was gone, its materials dispersed, its land repurposed. But what had been found there persisted in ways that mattered more than brick and timber. The foundation Mia directed helped hundreds of farming families annually, giving them resources to escape industries that had exploited their grandparents and parents. The research generated from the Thornton documents had reshaped academic understanding of agricultural fraud and tobacco industry dishonesty. The preservation work Jacob's company did honored complicated histories while serving modern needs. All of it traced back to that November morning when he'd raised his hand at a county auction and the auctioneer had laughed at someone bidding on a condemned warehouse. The laughter had seemed cruel at the time, had highlighted Jacob's desperation and the absurdity of spending money he didn't have on property nobody wanted. But that desperate bid had been the first step in a journey that revealed evidence powerful interests had preferred to stay buried, that created accountability decades delayed but finally achieved, that honored victims of fraud even though compensation was impossible. Lawrence Thornton had died believing he'd failed, that his legacy was destroyed, that his participation in systematic fraud would be his family's final remembrance. But his hidden vault had eventually served purposes he couldn't have imagined, had created foundations and exhibits and preservation programs that honored the people he'd harmed while acknowledging his own complicated role in their suffering. That was redemption of a sort, not forgiveness, because the crimes were too serious for that, but acknowledgement that even flawed people could contribute to justice if they left evidence and trusted that eventually someone would use it properly. Jacob had been that someone, had made choices that honored Lawrence's final request even though those choices offered no personal enrichment. 20 years later, those choices still created ripples that extended far beyond the initial discovery. Farming families still received truth that explained their histories. Communities still preserved buildings that told complicated stories about agricultural heritage and economic exploitation. Researchers still studied evidence that revealed how systematic dishonesty had operated across generations. And Jacob still felt the satisfaction of having made decisions he could be proud of when he looked back, of having chosen transparency over concealment, collaboration over exclusion, truth over convenience. The $415 had been the best money he'd ever spent, not because it bought property or generated profit, but because it led to discoveries that mattered more than any financial return. The museum closed as evening approached, guards politely shepherding visitors toward exits. Jacob and young Lawrence left last, the boy tired but still asking questions about what they'd seen, already processing the complicated story of crime and documentation and eventual revelation. Will people remember the vault forever? Lawrence asked as they walked to the car. Maybe not forever, Jacob said honestly. But for as long as people care about truth and accountability and learning from history. As long as farming communities need help understanding why their ancestors struggled. As long as there are families trying to build better futures from complicated pasts. The vault and what it contained will matter to those people, will serve purposes Lawrence Thornton hoped for even if he couldn't achieve them himself. They drove home through the dusk, past farmland that stretched to horizons older than human memory, past barns that held stories of labor and exploitation, past communities that had survived tobacco's rise and fall through resilience and adaptation. The land remembered everything, the crimes and the documentation, the hiding and the revelation, the silence and the eventual accountability. Jacob thought about the warehouse that had started everything, about lifting floorboards seeking salvage value and finding instead a bricked-up room concealing a vault. He thought about Dorothy's desperate offer of $10,000 just for a meeting, about opening the safe together and finding not wealth but evidence, about the choice to bring that evidence forward rather than hiding it for personal gain. Every step of the journey had required decisions about what mattered more, personal benefit or broader consideration, immediate profit or long-term impact, comfortable silence or difficult truth. At each decision point, Jacob had chosen the harder path, the one that served principles rather than convenience. Those choices had defined his character, had shaped his daughter's and grandson's understanding of integrity, had created outcomes that served communities rather than just enriching one person who'd happened to find hidden evidence. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy built through choice rather than accident, truth revealed rather than comfortable lies maintained, accountability achieved even when it came decades too late to fully restore what fraud had stolen. The vault stood open in its museum home, its secrets told, its contents serving purposes Lawrence Thornton had hoped for even though he'd lacked courage to pursue those purposes while living. And somewhere, tobacco farming families still received truth that explained their struggles, still learned that the system had been rigged against their grandparents, still found validation that their poverty hadn't been personal failure but structural injustice. That understanding couldn't restore what had been stolen, couldn't compensate for decades of systematic fraud. But it gave them dignity of acknowledgement, validation that their experiences were real and their suspicions justified. The warehouse was gone, its materials dispersed to other buildings, its story preserved in museum exhibits and foundation programs and preservation projects. But what had been found there persisted, in families who finally had answers, in communities that understood their histories, in the knowledge that buried things eventually surface when circumstances bring someone willing to look and brave enough to reveal what they find. Jacob had been that someone, not through any special virtue but through accumulated choices made when tested by circumstances that made right and easy diverge. He'd bought a warehouse for $415 seeking salvage material, had found instead evidence that reshaped understanding and created accountability. The auctioneer's laughter had marked the beginning of revelation neither of them could have predicted, the first step in a journey that honored truth over profit and chose complexity over comfortable simplification. 20 years later, that journey continued, in foundation work in museum exhibits, in farming families and preserved buildings, in the understanding that legacy was something you built rather than something you inherited. The vault had opened, its secrets told, its contents serving justice even though justice came decades late. That was redemption of a sort, incomplete but meaningful, honoring victims while acknowledging perpetrators' complicated roles in both crime and eventual revelation. The land breathed in the evening air, its stories preserved, its buried things surfaced, its truth available to anyone willing to learn from history's difficult lessons. The warehouse was gone but the vault remained, standing as testament that silence eventually breaks, that buried evidence eventually surfaces, and that sometimes desperate people buying condemned buildings make choices that honor truth even when lies would have been more profitable and far more convenient. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.